Imagine answering the phone in the dead of night, hearing the voice of a stranger, desperate and pleading. On the other end, a man tells you that his grandfather is dying and needs the final prayers, the last rites. Would you go? Would you trust that voice in the dark? Father Reynaldo Rivera didn't hesitate. He was a man of faith, a servant of his community, and when the call came on that warm July night in 1982, he didn't think twice about what he needed to do. He had spent his life tending to the souls of Santa Fe, comforting the grieving, and helping those in need. It was a role he embraced fully no matter the hour, no matter the place. That night, Father Rivera was at the rectory of St. Francis Cathedral, where he'd served faithfully for years. The phone rang. A man's voice on the other end, sounding frantic, claimed his grandfather was on the brink of death, just outside Santa Fe, near a place few would dare to travel after dark, a desolate, dusty road near Waldo. Father Rivera, committed to his calling, took down the details, asked no questions, and set off into the night. It was his duty. The priest was known for his kindness, his unwavering willingness to help anyone, no matter how dangerous the situation might be. But this night would be different. This time, there would be no return. As the night wore on and the hours passed, those who worked with Father Rivera began to worry. The priest had never been one to stray far from the cathedral. He had always returned to the safety of the rectory after administering last rites or visiting parishioners, but tonight there was only silence. It wasn't long before a search was launched. Father Rivera's car would be found abandoned near the small, ghostly town of Waldo, but the priest was nowhere in sight. Fear began to take hold, and within hours the full weight of horror would settle in. Father Reynaldo Rivera had walked into a trap, answering a call that no one should ever have had to answer. He had set out to bring peace to a dying man, but instead he found something far more sinister waiting for him. What happened to Father Rivera on that lonely road outside Santa Fe? Why was he targeted? And who was behind the call that lured him to his death? Stay with me as we uncover the dark mystery behind the murder of Father Reynaldo Rivera, a crime that still haunts Santa Fe to this very day. A priest who always came back home, never returned. What began as concern soon turned to dread, and by morning it became a full-blown nightmare. Where was Father Reynaldo Rivera? The silence in the rectory was unnerving. Father Reynaldo Rivera had never been one to stray far without word, and as the hours ticked by after his departure, unease began to creep into the hearts of those who knew him best. The church staff had grown accustomed to the rhythms of his life, late-night visits to comfort the sick, urgent calls to administer last rites, but he always returned. That night, though, the rectory remained empty, his footsteps absent from its halls. By the early hours of the following morning, the initial concern turned into outright panic. The church staff made phone calls, contacted friends, anyone who might have seen or heard from him. Nothing, not a single trace of the priest, and the sense that something was very, very wrong began to settle over the cathedral. The search for Father Rivera began quietly, but quickly gained urgency. His colleagues, deeply worried, knew that time was not on their side. The hours were slipping by too fast, and every passing minute without contact fueled their fears. The idea that this was just a simple delay, a minor inconvenience, began to crumble. As the search spread out into the surrounding area, a discovery was made. It was Father Rivera's car, abandoned, left alone near a desolate stretch of road just outside the small, near-forgotten town of Waldo. The town itself was nothing more than a ghost, a faint memory of what once had been, and here, on this lonely patch of earth, sat the priest's vehicle. But there was no sign of Father Rivera. The sight of the abandoned car struck hard, sending waves of dread through everyone involved. It was as if the quiet desert itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The search intensified, but despite the efforts, despite the growing number of people combing the area, there was nothing. No movement, no clues, just an empty car and an overwhelming sense of something terrible lurking in the distance. By now, the news of his disappearance had spread. In a town like Santa Fe, the vanishing of a beloved priest was more than just a concern, it was a crisis. The community held its breath, waiting, praying for any news, any sign that this nightmare could be resolved with Father Rivera's safe return. But as the hours dragged on, it became painfully clear that Father Reynaldo Rivera had not simply gone missing. Something darker had taken place, and whatever it was, it left the church and the community shaken to their core. What had started as a search was now a desperate race against time. But the question remained, where was Father Rivera? The desert keeps its secrets well, but it couldn't hide what lay waiting on that lonely stretch of road, a discovery that would shake Santa Fe to its core. Father Reynaldo Rivera had been found, but it was far too late. The land surrounding Waldo was vast and unforgiving, a place where the sun beat down relentlessly and the wind whispered through the dry sagebrush like a warning. It was in this desolate terrain, on a stretch of dirt road, that the search for Father Rivera came to its grim conclusion. The searchers had scoured the area relentlessly, their hope fading with every hour, but they were not prepared for what they found. Just off the road, on a barren patch of ground where nothing but dust and silence prevailed, lay Father Reynaldo Rivera's lifeless body. The scene was haunting, the air thick with the eerie stillness that only the desert could offer. Father Rivera was sprawled out on the dirt, his face calm, almost as if in peace. But it was the wound that told the real story, a single gunshot to the chest, fired with precision. It wasn't random. This was a killing with purpose, and its cruelty was chilling. The beloved priest had not simply disappeared. He had been executed. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. In Santa Fe, a city known for its rich culture and deep spirituality, the murder of Father Rivera was unthinkable. He was more than just a priest. He was a fixture in the community, a guiding light for so many. His death, especially in such a brutal and heartless manner, left the town in shock, its people grasping for answers that weren't there. As investigators descended on the scene, questions swirled in the dusty air. How had Father Rivera ended up here? The area was remote, far from the rectory where he had received that fateful call. Whoever had lured him out had known exactly what they were doing, drawing him away from safety, away from witnesses, into the middle of nowhere. The isolation of the spot where his body was found suggested a well-planned trap. The condition of his body offered few answers. There were no signs of a struggle. Father Rivera had likely been caught off guard, trusting the man who had called him in desperation. The shot that ended his life had been swift, coldly calculated. No robbery, no signs of rage, just a single shot, an execution in the quiet desert night. Speculations ran wild. Who would do this? Why target a priest? Was there something more behind the call, or had Father Rivera simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Some believed it could have been an act of revenge, a vendetta against the church or Father Rivera himself. Others whispered about darker forces, perhaps someone who had crossed paths with the priest in confession or in some spiritual battle that had turned deadly. But no theory could soothe the raw fear and confusion that now gripped the community. Father Rivera's death was not just a loss, it was an attack on the very heart of the town. As they gathered in grief, one thing became clear: this was not the ending anyone had hoped for. The murder of Father Reynaldo Rivera left more questions than answers, and as the investigation deepened, so did the darkness surrounding the case. How had it come to this? What could possibly explain the cold-blooded execution of a man who had devoted his life to helping others? When someone is murdered, there's usually some thread that leads investigators to the truth. But in the case of Father Reynaldo Rivera, it was as if the desert itself swallowed the answers. A priest is dead, and the silence is deafening. From the moment Father Rivera's body was discovered, the investigation faced an uphill battle. Detectives combed the scene, hoping to find anything that could shed light on the crime. But as the hours passed, frustration mounted. There were no footprints, no shell casings, no signs of struggle. The desert had given them a body, but no clues. The initial steps of the forensic investigation yielded almost nothing. The dry New Mexico air, combined with the isolated location, had erased any hope of finding clear evidence. It was as if whoever had committed the crime had vanished without a trace, leaving only the chilling proof of their violence behind. The investigators were left with a deeply unsettling realization. This wasn't a spur of the moment killing. It had been planned and executed with chilling precision. Then there was the phone call, the single lead that might have offered some answers. The man who called the rectory had claimed to need last rites for his dying grandfather. It was that call that had pulled Father Rivera into the night. But when the investigators traced it, they hit a dead end. The call had been placed from a payphone in Santa Fe. No surveillance cameras, no witnesses who remembered anyone unusual, no fingerprints left on the phone. Just static silence like every other aspect of this case. The fact that the killer had used a payphone indicated a disturbing level of forethought. This wasn't a crime of passion committed on a whim. The murderer had chosen a place where they could not be tracked, lured Father Rivera to an isolated location, and vanished into the night, leaving nothing but questions. The Santa Fe community, already reeling from the discovery of Father Rivera's body, was now confronted with the terrifying reality that there was nothing, no solid lead, no physical evidence, no witness to guide the investigation forward. It was as if a shadow had crept into their town, taken one of their most beloved figures, and disappeared before anyone could react. The investigation's lack of progress only fueled the growing fear and suspicion. People in Santa Fe began locking their doors earlier, watching the streets more closely. If a man as respected and loved as Father Rivera could be targeted, who was safe? And more chillingly, how could a crime so brazen, so calculated, leave no trace? Investigators worked tirelessly, retracing Father Rivera's steps, re examining every detail of his final day, but there was nothing to be found. No disgruntled parishioners, no personal vendettas. Father Rivera, it seemed, had no enemies, at least none that anyone knew of. And yet, someone had called him. Someone had led him to his death, and that someone had vanished, leaving nothing but fear in their wake. As the days passed, hope began to fade. With no evidence, no witnesses, and no clear motive, the case was stalling. The silence surrounding the investigation was deafening, and the few threads detectives did have were unraveling quickly. The absence of any real clues made the case all the more haunting. How could a man be murdered in cold blood, in such a premeditated fashion, with not a single trace left behind? When a man of peace is murdered, the question that haunts us most is why? Why would someone target a priest, a man whose life was built around helping others? Was it a crime of opportunity, or was Father Reynaldo Rivera marked for death from the moment he answered that fateful call? The murder of Father Reynaldo Rivera wasn't just shocking because of its brutality. It was the target that sent shockwaves through the community. A priest, a man known for his kindness, gunned down in cold blood. But as the investigation stalled and the lack of physical evidence became apparent, one question grew louder. What was the motive? One of the first theories investigators entertained was the possibility of a random act of violence. After all, the road where Father Rivera's body was found was remote and easy spot for someone looking to commit a crime without being seen. Could it have been a senseless killing, a robbery gone wrong, or an opportunistic act of violence against a man who simply trusted too easily? But the problem with this theory was that nothing had been taken from Father Rivera. His personal belongings were untouched, and there were no signs that robbery was the motive. The single gunshot wound, the careful planning, it all suggested something far more deliberate. If robbery wasn't the motive, could it have been something deeper, something personal? The church is a sanctuary for many, but it can also be a place where people harbor their darkest secrets. Theories began to swirl that perhaps Father Rivera had heard something he shouldn't have. Could the killer have been someone who had once come to Father Rivera for confession? As a priest, Father Rivera would have been bound by the sacred seal of the confessional, unable to share what was told to him in confidence, no matter how disturbing the confession might have been. Could someone have confessed a crime or revealed something so dark that they feared the priest might become a threat to them? While there's no evidence to suggest Father Rivera broke the seal of confession, the possibility that someone believed he knew too much lingered in the minds of investigators. It raised an unsettling question. Had his role as a spiritual guide led him straight into the path of a killer? Then there was the theory of resentment against the church itself. The Catholic Church has long been a symbol of power and influence, and for some, that power breeds contempt. Could Father Rivera have been targeted as a representation of the institution he served? Anti-religious sentiment, especially during times of cultural tension, can sometimes manifest in violent ways. Had Father Rivera's faith made him a target for someone with a deep hatred for the church? There were whispers, too, of personal grudges, resentment that might not have been directed at Father Rivera himself, but at what he stood for. The priest had no known enemies, but the church was not immune to conflicts. Disputes over land, parish decisions, or even personal relationships within the community could easily escalate. Was there someone harboring a quiet grudge against the church, using Father Rivera as a pawn in a much larger game of revenge? What makes this case so perplexing is that Father Rivera, by all accounts, was a man without enemies. But sometimes it's not the enemies you know that pose the greatest threat, it's the ones lurking in the shadows, unseen, waiting for their moment. As investigators dove deeper into the priest's life, these questions began to swirl. Was it personal, or was it simply that Father Rivera was in the wrong place at the wrong time? Every theory felt possible, but none seemed to fit perfectly. What is clear is that whoever killed Father Rivera did so with a purpose. This wasn't a random attack. It was planned, calculated. He had been lured out into the night with a story designed to pull at his deepest sense of duty, and once he was isolated, the trap was sprung. The motive behind this killing remains one of the greatest mysteries of the case. Whether it was personal, driven by secrets or hatred or something else entirely, one thing is certain. Father Rivera had been caught in the crosshairs of someone's dark intentions. In the role of a priest, Father Reynaldo Rivera was not just a man, he was a symbol, a figure of trust, compassion, and faith. But could these very qualities, the ones that made him beloved, have also made him vulnerable? Could his position as a religious leader have marked him for death? To understand the murder of Father Reynaldo Rivera, we must confront a possibility that sends shivers through the heart of the community. Was this killing driven by something darker than personal vendettas or random violence? Could this have been a crime rooted in his role as a priest, a direct attack on the Catholic Church itself? Father Rivera's position placed him in a delicate balance of trust and vulnerability. As a priest, he had open access to the hearts and minds of his congregation. He was the keeper of their confessions, the one who guided them through life's toughest moments. But with that trust came a certain exposure. He was always available, always willing to go wherever he was needed. And on the night of July 7th, 1982, that openness may have been exploited. To serve as a priest, especially in a remote area like Santa Fe, means being vulnerable in ways that most of us aren't. Priests are often seen as safe, approachable, someone you can rely on in moments of desperation. But in Father Rivera's case, that same availability could have made him an easy target for someone looking to harm not just him, but what he represented. The Catholic Church, especially in small communities, often stands as a symbol of stability and influence. But with that influence can come resentment. Across history, religious leaders have been targeted, not because of who they are personally, but because of the institution they represent. Was Father Rivera's murder part of a larger anger toward the church? Was someone trying to make a statement through his death? At the time of his killing, the Catholic Church was not immune to controversy. Scandals, power struggles, and shifting social landscapes had led to growing resentment in some corners. Could Father Rivera have been caught in the crossfire of larger forces, a victim of someone's frustration with the church itself? And yet, there is another possibility that cannot be ignored. Was it Father Rivera's very kindness, his unguarded nature, that made him vulnerable? The priest had no reason to question the man who called him that night. When someone reached out, asking for the last rites for a dying loved one, Father Rivera answered that call without hesitation. He believed in his mission as a priest, in his duty to serve, and that sense of obligation may have blinded him to the dangers lurking in the shadows. Priests, particularly in isolated areas, walk a fine line between being symbols of authority and being remarkably exposed. Father Rivera didn't have the protection of crowds or busy city streets. He lived in a place where trust was often given freely and where boundaries between clergy and community were blurred. Could it be that someone took advantage of his open-hearted nature? Could his faith in the goodness of people have been weaponized against him? The murder of a priest isn't just the murder of a man. It's an attack on a figure who holds moral and spiritual authority. And that's what makes this crime so disturbing. Whether the motive was rooted in personal hatred, revenge, or a broader statement against the church, one thing is certain: Father Rivera's position made him an easy target for someone who knew exactly how to manipulate his sense of duty. Religious crimes, those that target clergy or religious figures, carry an added weight. They're not just crimes against individuals, but against what those individuals stand for. And in the case of Father Rivera, it's hard to shake the feeling that his death wasn't just a random act of violence, but a deliberate attack on his role as a priest. As the investigation struggled to uncover clues, this disturbing possibility loomed large. Was Father Rivera's murder a symbolic act, a statement of rage against the church, or the cold calculation of someone who knew that a priest would never turn down a call for help? The religious angle only deepened the mystery, adding another layer to an already complex case. Just when the mystery of Father Reynaldo Rivera's murder seemed isolated, a crime too strange, too chilling to be part of something larger, another priest vanished under eerily similar circumstances. Hundreds of miles away, in the rugged landscapes of Montana, Father John Patrick Kerrigan stepped into the night and was never seen again. Could these two cases be connected? And if so, does that connection point to something far more terrifying? In August of 1984, just 2 years after the murder of Father Rivera in New Mexico, another priest, Father John Patrick Kerrigan, disappeared in Montana. He had been a man much like Father Rivera, dedicated to his faith, known for his compassion and serving in a small community. One day, just like Father Rivera, Father Kerrigan vanished without a trace, leaving behind more questions than answers. The parallels between these two cases are haunting. Father Kerrigan had been last seen buying a newspaper and some candy in Ronan, Montana. Later, his car was found abandoned on the side of the road, much like Father Rivera's had been. Nearby, searchers discovered some of Father Kerrigan's personal belongings: his bloodied clothes, his wallet, and a coat hanger twisted into the shape of a noose. But Father Kerrigan himself was nowhere to be found. To this day, his body has never been recovered. The similarities between the two cases sent a chill through those who were familiar with the details. Both priests were called away, both cars abandoned in remote locations. Both men disappeared under mysterious and violent circumstances. In the wake of Father Kerrigan's disappearance, investigators in Montana and New Mexico began to wonder if they were dealing with something far more sinister. Could a serial killer be targeting Catholic priests? Theories of a potential serial killer arose quickly. The idea that someone was preying on clergymen, specifically priests who served in isolated rural areas, was a disturbing possibility. Could the killer have been someone with a deep-seated hatred for the church, methodically hunting priests who were trusted by their communities? The remote locations, the lack of physical evidence, and the calculated nature of the attacks pointed toward someone who knew what they were doing, someone with a specific motive, someone who understood how to erase their tracks. Father Kerrigan's case sent shockwaves through the Catholic Church, especially when investigators couldn't ignore the striking similarities to Father Rivera's murder. Both crimes shared the hallmarks of meticulous planning: priests lured away under false pretenses, cars abandoned as if to mock the authorities, and most chillingly, a complete absence of witnesses or useful forensic evidence. But what made these cases even more unsettling was the broader pattern of violence against clergy during this period. In the 80s, attacks on religious figures, particularly priests, were not unheard of. The Catholic Church, embroiled in various controversies at the time, was becoming a target for those with grievances, whether personal, political, or ideological. Could these two priests have become victims of a broader wave of anti-clerical violence? Or was there something even more methodical at play? The theory of a serial killer took hold in part because of the sheer precision with which both Father Rivera and Father Kerrigan were taken. Both were men of faith, men who trusted in the goodness of others. Their openness, their willingness to help, had been weaponized against them. Whoever was responsible knew exactly how to exploit their kindness, leading them to their deaths in the shadows of rural America. Father Kerrigan's disappearance, like Father Rivera's, remains unsolved to this day. No body, no suspect, no clear motive. Just silence and grief, the same haunting emptiness that shrouded the murder of Father Rivera. The connection between the two cases remains a disturbing possibility, a thread that investigators have never been able to fully untangle. Could it be that the same hand reached out across state lines, claiming the lives of two men who had devoted themselves to the service of others? As the years passed, the theory of a serial killer faded from the headlines, but for those who knew Father Rivera and Father Kerrigan, the chilling possibility remains. Two priests, two lives stolen, and a mystery that continues to loom over both communities. When justice is delayed, hope begins to wither. The murder of Father Reynaldo Rivera may have begun with a mystery, but as days turned to weeks and weeks to years, it transformed into something far more painful: a cold case. And for those who loved him, it felt like justice itself had been taken from them. As the weeks after Father Rivera's murder dragged on, the initial shock and grief that gripped Santa Fe slowly gave way to something darker: despair. The community had lost more than just a priest. They had lost their sense of security, their faith that such a heinous act could ever be solved. And as the investigation grew colder, that despair turned into frustration, especially for those closest to Father Rivera. For Father Rivera's loved ones and his congregation, the waiting was unbearable. Every Sunday, his absence was felt in the quiet moments before Mass, in the empty seat where he once prayed, and in the unspoken grief shared among parishioners who had come to rely on his guidance. The parish at St. Francis Cathedral was not just mourning a man, they were mourning the loss of answers, of closure. The investigators, too, felt the weight of the unsolved case hanging over them. In the immediate aftermath of Father Rivera's murder, there had been a flurry of activity. Leads were chased down, interviews were conducted, and for a brief moment there had been hope that the killer would be found. But as the evidence failed to materialize and the phone call led to a dead end, that hope began to fade. For detectives, the frustration was palpable. Every new tip that surfaced seemed to offer a glimmer of possibility, but time and again those tips led nowhere. People would come forward claiming to know something, or strangers would call with cryptic information, but each lead would eventually unravel, leaving investigators back where they started with nothing. The case of Father Rivera wasn't just cold, it was frozen in place, locked in the unforgiving grip of silence. As the months turned into years, it became clear that unless someone came forward with new information, the case might never be solved. Detectives who had once been full of determination began to feel the crushing weight of failure. They had followed every possible thread, and yet they were left with an unsolved murder, a haunting crime with no suspect, no motive, and no end in sight. But for the people of Santa Fe, giving up wasn't an option. Father Rivera's memory lived on, and so did the hope, however faint, that someday justice would be served. There were moments, even years after his death, when a new lead would spark hope. Rumors circulated about possible suspects, and there were whispers that someone knew more than they were saying. But each time, those leads faded into the background, swallowed by the same void that had consumed the investigation from the start. The emotional toll was staggering. Father Rivera's friends, colleagues, and family were left in limbo, unable to properly grieve because the story had no ending. His congregation, too, struggled to move forward, haunted by the idea that whoever had killed their priest was still out there, walking free without any consequence. The fear that the same hand could strike again lingered, casting a long shadow over the church and the community. As the case grew colder, the frustration became more personal. Father Rivera was not just another statistic, not just another name in a long list of unsolved murders. He was a man who had devoted his life to helping others, and the thought that his killer might never be brought to justice was almost too much to bear. In moments of grief, the community came together. Candlelight vigils were held, and prayers for justice echoed through the cathedral that Father Rivera had once called home. But the lack of progress weighed heavily on everyone. How could something so horrific happen, and how could it go unsolved for so long? The detectives who had worked the case didn't forget. Many of them carried the weight of Father Rivera's murder with them throughout their careers, the memory of an investigation that had once felt solvable but had slipped through their fingers. Some still hoped that a break would come, that a confession or a piece of long buried evidence would finally surface. But as time went on, those hopes dimmed, replaced by the cold, hard reality that this case might remain unsolved forever. For those closest to Father Rivera, though, the frustration was less about the investigation itself and more about the deeper injustice. They had been robbed not only of a beloved priest, but of the chance for closure, the opportunity to know why he had been taken from them and who had committed such a brutal act. And in the absence of answers, all they were left with was grief. Time may have passed, but the mystery surrounding Father Reynaldo Rivera's murder has never truly faded. Decades later, the pain of his loss remains, and so too does the lingering question of why. New voices, both amateur sleuths and seasoned investigators, have taken up the case, each trying to answer the question that has haunted Santa Fe for so long: who killed Father Rivera and why? In the years since Father Rivera's murder, his case has drifted in and out of public attention. For the people who knew and loved him, the pain of his loss never dulled. The unsolved nature of his murder kept that pain fresh, as if time had stood still on that fateful night in July, with no justice, no answers, and no closure. But in recent years, the cold case has sparked new interest from those who weren't willing to let it go. Investigators, armchair detectives, and even members of the true crime community have revisited the case, poring over old files, re-examining the scant details, and proposing new theories in the hope that one of them might finally crack the puzzle that has eluded law enforcement for so long. One of the most compelling aspects of Father Rivera's case is its sheer lack of obvious motive. Many of the emerging theories center around this, each trying to piece together why someone would target a priest, a man who, by all accounts, had no enemies. As these new voices have stepped in, they've brought fresh perspectives and new speculations, some of which have breathed new life into a case that had grown cold. One of the most discussed theories is that Father Rivera's murder was part of a larger conspiracy, possibly involving the church itself or individuals with ties to organized crime. Some armchair detectives have speculated that Father Rivera may have stumbled upon information he wasn't supposed to know, perhaps a secret involving a parishioner or even a confession that implicated powerful figures. These theories, while tantalizing, have never been substantiated, but they do raise questions about the darker forces that could have been at play. Others believe that the murder was more random, the work of a drifter or someone passing through, taking advantage of Father Rivera's trust and generosity. The fact that the killer lured him out under the guise of a plea for help has led many to believe that the crime was opportunistic, targeting the priest because he was an easy mark. But even this theory struggles to explain the cold, calculated way in which the murder was carried out. The execution style killing suggests that whoever committed the crime had planned it carefully, with the intent to kill from the start, making a random act of violence seem less likely. Some theorists have turned to behavioral profiling, suggesting that the killer may have been someone with a deep hatred for the church, possibly motivated by personal grievances or past trauma. In recent years, this line of thinking has gained traction, especially in light of growing awareness about the psychological patterns behind certain violent crimes. Could the killer have been someone who saw Father Rivera as a stand in for the institution he despised? Someone who used the priest's kindness and faith as a way to exact a personal vendetta? As the years have gone by, even the most seasoned investigators who have revisited the case have found themselves frustrated by the lack of new evidence. However, some breakthroughs have come from technological advancements. While forensic evidence was almost non existent at the time of the murder, modern technology, like advancements in DNA testing and digital forensics, has led to a renewed interest in cases that were once thought unsolvable. Though no major breakthroughs have been announced, investigators hold out hope that one day a small piece of overlooked evidence could lead to a break in the case. The rise of online communities and amateur sleuths has also added a new dimension to Father Rivera's case. Websites, forums, and podcasts dedicated to unsolved mysteries have brought renewed attention to the story. Armchair detectives, combing through the details of the case, have formed their own theories, sometimes challenging the traditional thinking of law enforcement. These digital detectives are relentless, using everything from old newspaper clippings to modern day crime databases in their attempts to solve the mystery. Some of these efforts have uncovered interesting leads, like re examining the payphone call that lured Father Rivera out. Could there have been witnesses who remembered something but never came forward? Were there other crimes in the area at the time that might provide a pattern? These questions, once dismissed, have been given new life by those unwilling to let the case fade into obscurity. Despite these efforts, the case remains unsolved, and with each new theory comes the reopening of old wounds. For Father Rivera's congregation and loved ones, the constant cycle of hope and disappointment has taken a toll. Every time a new theory surfaces, it brings with it the painful reminder that justice has yet to be served. And yet, these emerging voices also offer a glimmer of hope that one day someone will find the missing piece, the crucial detail that leads to the truth. Father Rivera's case, decades later, continues to evoke strong emotions and intense speculation. Theories will continue to swirl, new perspectives will keep emerging, and the determination to solve this haunting crime has not waned. But with every new theory comes the same haunting question. Will this mystery ever be truly solved, or is the truth destined to remain hidden in the shadows? Decades have passed since Father Reynaldo Rivera was murdered on that lonely stretch of New Mexico desert. And yet, here we are, still asking the same questions, still waiting for justice. When a crime remains unsolved for so long, it leaves more than just wounds, it leaves a void, a place where answers should be, but where silence reigns instead. There is a special kind of pain that comes with an unsolved crime, a pain that lingers in the hearts of those who loved Father Rivera and in the community that still mourns his loss. It is the ache of knowing that his killer walks free and that the person responsible for such a cruel act has never been brought to account. For Santa Fe, this unresolved case is more than just a tragedy. It is a wound that has never healed. As the years have stretched on, the hope for justice has flickered like a candle in the wind. Every so often it burns bright with a new theory, a new lead, or a glimmer of hope from advancements in technology. But each time that light has dimmed again as the truth remains out of reach. For Father Rivera's family, his congregation, and the community he served, the unanswered questions continue to echo through the decades. Why him? Who could have lured a priest one known for his kindness and dedication into such a dark and deadly trap? Was it someone he trusted, someone who took advantage of his willingness to help, or a stranger driven by motives that we may never understand? Unsolved crimes like Father Rivera's leave behind a legacy of grief, but they also leave a legacy of frustration. The investigators who worked tirelessly on the case have watched it slip further and further from the realm of solvability. Detectives retired, leads grew cold, and the file that once burned with urgency now sits in the dusty archives of unsolved mysteries. For them, the inability to bring justice for Father Rivera is a burden that will never fully lift. They are haunted not just by the crime itself, but by the feeling that they came so close to the truth only to have it slip away. Father Rivera's murder is more than just a crime that has gone cold. It is a reminder of the cruel realities of justice delayed. For many, justice isn't just about finding the killer, it's about the closure that comes with answers. It's about the peace that a community can find when the truth is finally laid bare. But for Father Rivera's community, peace has been elusive. The answers they seek may never come, and the silence surrounding his case may never be broken. The question now isn't just about whether his killer will ever be found, it's about whether the people who loved him will ever get the closure they so desperately need. Will there be justice for Father Rivera, or will his case become one of the many unsolved mysteries that are eventually resigned to history, unsolved and unexplained? The tragedy of Father Rivera's case is that, in the absence of justice, his memory remains bound to the questions of his death. His legacy, though filled with the good he did for so many, is forever entwined with the unsolved mystery of his murder. Every conversation about Father Rivera ends with the same heart-wrenching question: why? The weight of this unsolved crime extends beyond the priest's life and death. It touches on something universal: the need for justice, the need for closure, and the heartbreaking reality that sometimes, no matter how much time passes, those things remain elusive. As we come to the end of this journey through Father Rivera's case, we are left with a haunting truth. Some mysteries may never be solved. The killer may never be found. The motive may never be revealed. And for those who loved him, this lack of resolution will remain a source of deep sorrow. But even in the absence of answers, Father Reynaldo Rivera's memory lives on. He was a man of faith, a man who gave his life to help others, and a man whose loss has left an unfillable void in the lives of so many. Though justice has been delayed and perhaps denied, his legacy of kindness, compassion, and dedication to his community remains intact. Let us not forget him. Let us not forget the injustice of his unsolved murder. And let us continue to hope that one day the truth will come to light. Until then, the shadow of Father Rivera's case will linger, a reminder that some stories don't have an ending, but that doesn't mean we stop seeking the truth. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and tragic death of Father Reynaldo Rivera. This has been Crime Pulse Stories, and I'm signing off, but the story of Father Rivera is far from over.